Good morning, everyone. We decided this topic was so important that we're going to spend another 90 minutes on it. And great, I think we could probably do a 2-3 day AFCEA event just on this topic, in fact. How are we doing on the back? Everyone hear us? All right. My name is John Dvorak from Salient CRGT. I'm very happy to be up here with this distinguished panel, which I'll introduce in a moment. To give you a sense of what we're planning on doing here, we've got 90 minutes of your time. We're between you and lunch. We're going to start off, each of our panelists will come up here to the mic and give you about somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, diving a little deeper into the subject from their perspective. And then at the end, we figure we're going to have about half the session Q&A. We think there's still a lot of questions out there, and there's some more discussion we want to field from you. So please, while you're listening here, take good notes, get your questions ready, because this session is going to be a lot about your questions and interaction with you. Our panel on the up here today includes Admiral Bill Studeman, Jake Schaffner, and Riley Repko. We're going to start actually with Admiral Studeman, and we're going to work our way with Jake and Riley are going to present afterwards. And then, like I said, 30 to 45 minutes Q&A. Each of our panelists has had a distinguished career in military, public, and private sectors. And we have great bios online, but I'm going to provide you some highlights. Starting with Jake, who's down at the end there. He's a graduate of University of Texas and the Naval Postgraduate School, where he earned an MSc in Systems Technologies. He served as Chief of Naval Operations Staff, served on the Joint Staff and the Directorate of Operations, Special Technology Operations Division, and contributed significantly to information warfare and information operations planning and exercise efforts. His final active duty assignment was on the IC Management Staff, where he served as Director of Information Operations Policy. Over the past 22 years, Mr. Schaffner has been either a principal or key contributing author to significant national level policy documents, and has been either a principal or, related to infrastructure protection, continuity of operations, cyber, IO, and STO. Following retirement from active duty, he continued his leadership in IO during his time at Cytor and Booz Allen Hamilton. He rejoined the Department of Defense in 2009 and now serves as the Senior Advisor for Technical and Mission Convergence in the Office of the Director of Signals Intelligence, Electronic Warfare, and Cyber. Mr. Repko, in seat 2, is a Strategic Advisor to the Air Force Secretary and Chief of Staff of Innovation and Modernization Issues, focusing on existing and future requirements. This position enables the Air Force management the awareness necessary to develop proper strategic planning, communications, and execution of existing programs. He serves as a functional expert and special advisor, collaborating with Defense Department organizations and industry. He's a highly qualified expert who will serve in this assignment for 3 years. He entered the Air Force Officer Training School in 1979. While on active duty, he served in staff assignments, including electronic warfare systems, as an electronic warfare systems engineer. He separated from active duty in 1984 and continued his military career in the Air Force Reserve for the next 22 years. Among other responsibilities, he's held assignments in space operations, modeling and simulation war game support. In March 2004, he deployed to Balad, Iraq, as the 332nd Air Expeditionary Wing Vice Commander and Director of Staff. As a civilian, Mr. Repko spent 30 years as a technology industry executive specializing in software, cybersecurity solutions, product sales, and strategic business development, both in the U.S. and the Asia-Pacific region. We're going to start our panel with Admiral Studeman. Admiral Studeman holds a BA in History from the University of the South and an MA in Public and International Affairs from George Washington University, as well as several honorary doctorates. He's a distinguished graduate of both the Naval and National War Colleges, and as a restricted line naval intelligence officer, Admiral Studeman served in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. His flags tours include OPNAV Director of Long Range Navy Planning, Director of Naval Intelligence, the Director of the National Security Agency, and Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence and the CIA, with 2 extended periods as acting director of those organizations. As DDCI, he served in both the George H.W. Bush and the Clinton administrations. Admiral Studeman retired from the Navy in 1995 after 34 years of service. His post-military career has included positions in the private sector, including at Northrop Grumman, where he served as VP and Deputy General Manager of the Mission Systems sector. Most of his semi-retired time today is spent on intelligence, cyber, information operations, and defense naval strategy matters. He continues to lecture at universities on intelligence and cyber matters and appears in periodic forums with discussions related to cyber and intelligence. And we're very honored to have him here today to begin our panel. With that, Admiral Studeman, the podium is yours.
Well, let's say it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Following General Hayden's really hard because he provided a great top-level umbrella view. I was actually asked specifically to frame up the subject of information warfare, more or less from a doctrinal point of view. So we're going to go down into the information warfare engine room, and we're going to talk about, if you will, the various components and if you will, doctrinal terms that are used. And I'm trying to globalize this. We're not just going to talk about U.S. doctrine. We're going to talk about what appears to be the doctrine of other people, the terms that other people use, et cetera. So we can get a far broader context, and I think it might support what General Hayden passed along. Let me say these are going to be my own views, my own private views, in the way in which this is context is defined. I'm going to use some electric words here to make the point about the objective intentions of the information warfare business, and it's going to be the motorcycle ride through the art gallery of information warfare because I have a lot of ground to cover here. Obviously, like cyber, intelligence, information warfare, and lots of other public policy related issues, these topics are highly overlapping. And so it's very important that we really understand how one is related to the other. I have long ago held that there is a large notional scope to the information conflict business areas, and so I want to speak to them a little bit in detail. First, in the context of U.S. doctrine, General Hayden already mentioned CNA, CND, CNE, and collectively CNO, computer network, defense attack, exploit operations, et cetera. Network focused, IT, telecommunications focused, software applications, et cetera, focused. It's fairly narrow definition for the people who do this as a business. Obviously, the computer network exploitation is heavily SIGINT, although it can be open source, it can be human intelligence, it can even be imagery. But if you take a look specifically at what happens in that domain, there are some very important tasks that I think we need to focus on. Destroy, deny, disrupt, deceive, degrade, usurp, corrupt, do essentially the battlefield surveillance mission, intimidate, enhance deterrence, do dissuasion, impose costs, create uncertainties. Otherwise, in the context of what normally happens, get into the mind of the adversary, challenge his control, his trust, his confidence, his agenda, his systems, his actions, his data, degrade his ability to see, know, understand, decide, and act. So that's kind of one sort of context. But very quickly, you move out of that sort of very narrowly defined area, certainly as a result of what's been happening in the information warfare, information conflict, information operations area that General Hayden described, and you get into the fact that it's also about intent, what's actually ongoing in the networks. It's about the content, about what's actually going on in the networks in essentially the environment that we're talking about. So there's a far larger context, a far bigger picture that we need to understand that involves the roles and responsibilities of various and sundry people. Even kinetic warfare is related to the conduct of cyber warfare and information warfare. Battlefield preparation, strategic communications, influence, messaging. We at one time in the Navy had the term perception management. What's already been mentioned is use of social media, fake news, exposés, that kind of thing. Down at the mission level in the U.S. electronic warfare, command and control countermeasures, demonstrations, exercises, simulations, operational deception. MISO mentioned this morning the new renamed psychological operations, to be politically correct. Our own generation of active measures, space and counterspace operations, covert action, which includes the propaganda mission, controlled and uncontrolled leaks fit in there somewhere. We talked about influence operations, Navy electromagnetic maneuver warfare, the kinds of things that relate to public diplomacy and public affairs that we talked about, that General Hayden talked about. Even interestingly, the subject in terms of weaponizing of cyber, the subject of electromagnetic pulse, which is a crossover point between cyber warfare and nuclear warfare, is an issue here. Battle management, C2, all forms of signaling, et cetera, in response. So that is a very large picture. Now, if you go to the Russian side of this, which was explained doctrinally in I think, layman's terms by General Hayden, for 200 years, the Russians have had the terms that relate to maskirovka, mask cover, disinformation, active measures, even possibly the term compromat, to compromise certain kinds of people or agendas or issues in the middle of all that. The Chinese, I find it's easier to go back almost to Sun Tzu, because Sun Tzu describes, in my view, fairly holistically in The Art of War, the whole list of kinds of activities that you might think about when you're doing the kinds of subtle manipulation that's required in peacetime for internal management and for dealing with external forces, as opposed to the Russians, who are very coercive in the way in which they apply these means. So that's sort of a broad, sweeping definition. But let me use some objective-related statements here. So the point is driven home very, very heavily. These are objective activities that are designed to actually influence target outcomes, behaviors writ large, and the intent and content are often contained inside and conveyed in the cyber media and cyber actions. They're designed to sow seeds of doubt, discontent, discord, disharmony, divisiveness, make populations distrustful and disheartened, and to force them to rally around lesser important issues and to create noise. Think about our own system right now. They have to be highly cost-imposing, of time, effort, and focus, and they have to tie adversaries up in their own domestic issues so that they're not addressing more likely more important global issues. In other words, they are fundamentally highly cost-imposing. They force adversaries to question their own systems, their own plans, their own directions, their own capabilities, their own control, and the likelihood of having any success in the context of how they're dealing internally or even externally. They tie adversaries up in internal knots and impose serious wasted focus and energy on lesser issues, propelled to the fore by the influence attackers' clever targeting, clever use of themes, very clever definition of how they choose to shape those themes and put them into the target environment. It's about stealing and going in to get the best ideas, to impact on markets, power, influence, success, resources. Make people question essentially what's happening and be confused about not only the present, but to be confused about the viability of the future. Exploit, exacerbate, build on already existing internal divisions, of which we have many in this country. and to deal with, to ride on, if you will, the polarizations, the politizations that already exist, the fears, the hot running emotions, essentially, that are already there present. They're also designed to avert gaze and create expenditures requirements to create, in a cost-imposing sense, to create expenditures in the area of time, money, people, energy, et cetera, on often emotional and, if possible, media hyped issues that may even be essentially at the edge of legal or ethical kinds of considerations. Often they are non-strategic and non-core in the classic sense of what's going on, but they are generally emotional and they have a following. So, let's just talk right now about the Department of Defense policy. We actually, going back to the fundamentals of U.S. definitions, we do have a still extant in the Dictionary of Military Terms, a definition for information operations, which govern the United States government and certainly the U.S. military in the context of our own doctrine. It's a very simple but elaborative statement of missions. The integrated employment during military operations of information-related capabilities in concert with other lines of operation to influence, disrupt, corrupt, usurp the decision-making of adversaries and potential adversaries while protecting our own. So essentially this, and then they tell you in the doctrinal terms to go see the definitions of electronic warfare, military deception, operational security, another component of this, operational deception, military information support operations, and generally speaking, the IO aspects of intelligence integration that supports all this. So, I think at this point, while I'm laying the groundwork, it's important for me to sort of dance off and try to just build on what it was that General Hayden laid the groundwork for. What's happening here, obviously, is that we're people, or in the context of conflict, have to create effects which play into an environment. That it's an environment that it's much more successful if they're played in when that environment is hyped, polarized, politicized, under a high-pressure, continuous kind of information streaming setting that is the type of setting that we have in this country today. And I think General Hayden addressed that really very well. So the key point right now is the issue that he discussed at the end of his talk, which is what can be done about this. And he mentioned several things, which I think we can talk about in Q&A. One, obviously, because I come from the intel community, the intel community can do a far better job of describing when, in fact, adversaries are choosing to use and via what media and via what delivery path they're choosing to do influence or messaging or strategic communications or active measures or whatever term you want to use. And essentially, what is the objective target of that? So there's definitely an intelligence role here, but in order to do that intelligence role, they somewhat have to be missionized. And that's an important issue today. Now, quite honestly, I think we're, by definition, inherently missionized to do this in a generic kind of sense. But it does require the kind of collection, dedicated collection, analysis, introspection, customer support, reporting out that in order to effectively do this job. So there is a threat. This is a threat dimension. Since the intelligence community deals in the threat areas, they have a definite role here. We've already seen at the other end of the spectrum, which General Hayden talked about, is a role for people like who are in the social media business. But also there's a whole series of issues here about role for people who are in the policy issue, the policy area, the planning area, and that sort of thing that relate to U.S. doctrine. So with that as a scene setter, which is my homework assignment, let me sit down, and I look forward to your questions and answers and the follow-on discussions. Thank you.
I've been told by many people that when you start talking, you should have a joke or something to lighten up the atmosphere. I am the joke. This is what happens when someone speaks after following a 4-star general and a 4-star admiral. Okay? Most of my really great ideas have been taken, so all this stuff I wrote is going to have to be ad-libbed. But I think I can add some original content. First off, since I'm an active government employee of the Department of Defense, I'm required to say some things. My comments are my own today. They are not endorsed by the Department of Defense. They should not be interpreted as statements of official DoD policy. They are not representative of political positions of the current or any other administration. I'm happy to answer your questions, but my answers are my own and not of the Department of Defense. Okay? All right, so I got that out there. I think I'd like to talk about myself for a moment, just to give you some context for where the comments will come from. I am not a flag or general officer, never had the privilege to be one, and have not served on the National Security Council or the higher levels of leadership in the Department of Defense. I am what will be loosely referred to as a utility hitter in the bureaucracy of DoD and the intelligence community. I am a defense intelligence senior leader. I'm one of those guys that you call when the boss wants to know how to get something done. So my field of specialization is about tools and their application, and less about why we want to use the tools or why we want to apply those tools to get something done. The General and the Admiral have spoken a lot to motivations of the Russians, a little bit in sidebar conversations about motivations of the Chinese. I spend most of my time trying to understand how things work. And my great privilege over the last pretty close to a quarter century now is that the folks I work for have allowed me to just indulge myself and get into the nitty-gritty about how one organizes to execute information operations, what tools we use, how the society as a whole is reacting to the development of technology. And I've observed what to me are some curious things. You know, I don't want to sound too critical here, but most people I talk to don't actually know how things work. You know, you give someone a cell phone and they can tell you all day long how to make the apps on it work. They have little understanding at all about the function of the processors on the inside, if they even knew that it had processors, how the thing functions as a component of an extended network. And most people that I talk to don't know the difference between the terms data and information. And they don't know that data and information are just the lower two steps on a hierarchy that includes the word knowledge and finally the word wisdom. And so what gets interesting when we start talking about things like information operations are that you find that people conflate terms and misuse terms, or, you know, if you want to be generous, they're not just very specific with what they are talking about. And so there's a lot of confusion gets generated in conversations about information operations. To sort of build on what the Admiral said, what Bill said, information operations is really an interdisciplinary field that is kind of agnostic about what you want to use it for. It's about the issue of how to use data and information, how do you manipulate them. If you step back a bit and you're a military person, you're looking at electronic warfare, you're actually talking about monkeying around with sensory systems and the exchange of the data generated by them, and you're monkeying around with the way that the machines that take that data react to it when they get it. MISO, or what used to be psychological operations, is kind of an extension of the same principles, but we're talking about feeding data and information to people and trying to get them to react to it. So there's an awful lot of man-machine interface, human and technology interface action going on in here, and you find people beginning to misuse terminology really fast. Now, back when I was on the Joint Staff and we were writing the first doctrine on information operations, after the term information warfare went out of vogue, we talked a lot about holistic application of these principles to things. The idea that you could use machines to influence people, and that we needed to spend a lot of time talking about sort of with almost scientific rigor about how you could predict what your impact would be on folks if you use tech in various ways or if you use techniques in various ways. And what you rapidly find out is that people screw up everything. You know, you can try predicting impacts of stuff all day long, and we have yet to come up with a repeatable theory with repeatable and provable results about how you manipulate populations. Instead, mostly what we get are generalized effects, some of which we know routinely will have the kind of impact you want if you want gross impact at a large level. And that's what the Russians have largely been doing with us. They may have sophisticated application of tools, but what they're doing is fundamentally what the worker bees would call, it's just a gross amplification attack. They know we're angry with each other, so they amplify the bloody hell out of that, okay? They happen to love Facebook and Cambridge Analytica because it gave them two things that are not, well, in the past were not generally available. Big block of raw data to work with so that they could just ideate all day long on how to build an attack, and then a feedback loop to tell them how effective they were in application of their amplification attack. For those of you who may have been in the Navy, I was a member of the surface line, and we used to have this silly motto inside the surface line, you know, because it was a pretty cutthroat in competition, and we used to say, it's not that I succeed, but that my peers fail, okay? And that's largely what the Russians have been playing. They are incredibly weak, they are incredibly strategically disadvantaged, and so they're playing us off against each other, mostly because they have no vision as to what good looks like in human society. That's the real bottom line. They can't offer a good vision for the future, so they'd prefer that we fail rather than they be held up for the failures that they are. Now, I'm not going to dwell any more on the Russians. What I'm going to dwell on is that as tech rolls out very, very quickly, and it interacts with a population that by and large doesn't really understand how the tech is being developed, there's a lot of friction generated by that. Inside the Department of Defense, even after, what do we want to call it? It's nearly 25 years since eligible receiver and evidence surprise, the original national level information operations exercises. We're still dealing with organizational responsibility and structural issues, trying to figure out how to fit things in. You know, in general, people still do the things that they've been doing historically in the past. You know, J6s and CIOs deal with communications, physical infrastructure kinds of issues, but they're not really good about talking about how that infrastructure reacts with actual command and control, the process of ideating and making good decisions. Operators still want to integrate cyber, whatever that's defined as, into their ops, and they're generally disappointed by not finding things they can just pull off the shelf like a kinetic munition and go immediately to work on, because they don't understand the time investment involved in doing that. So I'm going to get off the podium by saying I have spent most of my time doing study work for my bosses on how these things interact with our existing organizational structures and giving them some murky vision about places where we should be investing our dollars and our intellectual capital in, because there's still an enormous amount to be worked out, and our traditional structures are not coping well with the pace of technological innovation and innovation in societal or cultural events such as the introduction of Facebook. So I look forward to your questions. I hope to help you or enlighten you on some things, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here.
First off, I'd like to thank AFCEA for the invitation, and it's a delight to be back on this wonderful campus. Like my OSD colleague, I'm with the Air Force. The perspectives I'm going to share today are mine and mine alone. As you heard from the backgrounds of the individuals, the leadership, the colleagues I'm delighted to be part of this panel with, my background is very much focused on technology and innovation. I'm not a policy person. I'm all about the how, not the what. So I spend a majority of my time looking at how to solve problems. When I got hired into this job 7 months ago, Secretary Dr. Heather Wilson made it very clear to me in 2 words, cause trouble. My wife thought she said, "Are you in trouble?" So it's not the first time, but as we listened to General Hayden this morning, I remember, to paraphrase a comment he had made several years back where he talked about, this man-made domain. He said, God developed the 4 natural domains, air, land, space, and the oceans, and man made the cyber domain. And God has done a much better job. All right, so if you think about that. So now I look at the environment that I spend my time in, and it's great to be right up there next to the glass doors working with our top 4. The challenge is I'm also surrounded by some of the finest 18th century thinkers you'd ever want to see. All right, so I don't tell them that. The issue is I spend a great deal of time internationally, and that experience has helped me understand how I need to work together with these communities. So if I can see a show of hands, because the question I'm going to ask is all related to alignment. I come from an environment, I spent 17 years working right for Larry Ellison at Oracle. And as to kind of piggyback the quip that Jake shared, he would remind me it's not whether I beat you, but how badly I beat you. All right, so think about the extraordinary comment that General Hayden talked about, the mindset that we need to get into. So can I see a show of hands? How many of you are familiar with the National Defense Strategy? How many of you have actually read it? Okay, it's a good number. It's 11 pages long, and I highly recommend you take a look at that, because from my perspective, you have a DoD perspective that the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, has put together, and it talks about restoring 3 things. 1, readiness. 2, strengthening alliances, and I see some Brazilians in here. Our partners are critical to this. And finally, business reform. Well, Secretary Wilson has her perspective, as the other services do, on how they respond to that chairman. Okay, so we have our CEO. So I relate to that. Again, I get calls from industry regularly, and all due respect to them, I enjoy looking at the unique backgrounds, especially the companies that are here today, but I do my homework, all right? So when you come to me, don't talk about your company and that you specialize in IO, IW, big data, or what have you. You need to understand what our priorities are and how your capabilities align with that, and we'll get along, basically much better. As you've heard from the speakers, and I'm sure from yesterday's presenters, the U.S. is not immune to any threat, okay? And a lot of this is driven by the reemergence of competition. Putin every day gets out there and he tells you, I've just built a capability of nuclear cruise missiles or hypervelocity capability. He's advertising. Okay, that's pretty interesting to me. That he does that, because when I think about the Air Force mission, and I see some airmen here in the room, colleagues of mine, defense is our #1 mission. okay? Got that part. But the question is, how do we leverage the capabilities and capacities that the private sector, academia, big business, small business, the private equity community, we have to have the advanced situational awareness to know how to vector to those capabilities when a challenge arises, okay? So when I hear about the challenges related and what General Hayden so eloquently shared this morning, I get that piece. When I get handed a requirement, part of what I do is determine what methodology I need to utilize to get me from A to B to jump to L, etc. The challenge is some of the hammerheads that I am delighted to serve with in my organization go from A to B and they want $10 million, and they want to deliver a solution. And that's, to me, ludicrous. And many of those individuals are on short stints. You know, a lot of the military, as most of you appreciate, are on these tours that last 2 years, so the continuity issue is a huge driving factor. We talk about sustainment, okay? You would not come to me if I was in the private sector with a plan to solve some of the problems we're talking about today unless you talk to me about the exit strategy up front. But I see some of the most capable ideas that come out of our research labs that we have, as taxpayers, have paid millions of dollars towards. And then after 2 or 3 years, they're coming back with a, quote, a tin cup asking for more money on a project that evidently there's no clear vision in how it's going to be delivered. Again, ludicrous, especially in an environment where when you hear about the capabilities of what Russia and China are trying to do, we've got to be ahead of the game here. There's a term out there called hybrid warfare, okay, and this is where countries like Russia, Iran, North Korea, they use specific tactics to achieve their national security objectives. Some of these tactics are economically related, and others are IO. You know, they have special forces, dedicated groups that do the types of things that General Hayden shared. A lot of this involves a range of different types of tools, from cyber espionage to directly impacting or attacking our networks. And again, if I know this is the issue, then my high-performance team, and my team is made up of a mix. It's not just military only. It's people in the room. It's those who I understand what capabilities and capacities you bring to the fight. And we sit down and figure out from the methodology how we're going to solve that problem. Technology is not the upfront solution. Most of the cases, it involves conflict resolution, having to go to some of these thinkers that don't quite get it and make sure they're on your side. Because as you listen to our secretary and our chief, they're all about rapid, doing things fast, okay, doing things smartly, causing that extraordinary impact. So depending on how you look at cyber, you know, I take it as an operator, I look at cyber as an enabling capability. Okay, it's kind of like cyber being the jet and getting the information. That's the bomb onto the target. All right, and so again, different people take different perspectives, and that's really where I come from. As most of you are aware, the Air Force is, like the other services, quite regimented. Okay, we're very cookie cutter. We have our traditional thinkers. On the other hand, we have this millennial group, these 18 to 30-year-olds. And to me, that's an opportunity for us. Why? Because it's this community that we have to entice. It's this community that we have to maintain. Just last week, our Chief of Staff, General Goldfein, handed out badges to a new code, new AFSC, called 14 Foxtrot. This is our IO community. Okay, this school takes students and basically teaches them social engineering. This is a comment that I talked to Adm Studeman, or he mentioned to me briefly before he got started. This is unique. These are individuals who, like our aggressors, are trying to understand how the adversary thinks. This is the environment that we need to get into. This is the plan. So it starts with kind of an awareness to the conversation, getting into the behaviors, and finally the events. and to be able to take airmen through that process. Not trivial, but this is where the Air Force focus is today. We always continually try to ensure that our narrative is on track. As General Hayden also mentioned, this is where a public affairs community within the Air Force works. We try to shift some story in our favor. Again, public affairs or IO, right? There's a lot of similarity there. Final point I'd like to make with regard to our teaching styles is that, especially when we're dealing with millennials want to develop their own skills. Okay, this is an area that we need to understand. Most have very clear paths and they come from an environment where flexible work schedules are what they're all about. They certainly have strong values and are locally and worldly, with it, but they also want to have mentors. Okay, they're not here to be treated like robots. In order for us to leverage the extraordinary, what the Air Force has done is we've actually invested in our innovation dollars in sums greater than $60 million by throwing money out to the wings to give to the squadrons to say, kind of like a spark tank or shark tank, come up with some of the ideas that align with our national defense strategy, or come up with an idea like that could work. And so there are companies like Google where they take 70% when you're hired there, you do your job. 20% you look at improvements to that particular job, and then 10% some crazy idea that may be able to impact the bottom line at Google. Well, I'm delighted that the Air Force today is flexible enough and willing enough to be able to look at these challenges and look at our young aspiring airmen and say, hey, is there something here within this community, this IO, IW, cyber community that we need to be doing differently? And this is an area that I would look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Okay, ready for questions and answers, folks. Again, if you would raise your hand, we'll get a mic runner out to you.
Yeah, Lynn Wells, just to follow up on Riley's point about PA and IO. I mean, this has been a lightning rod for a long time about how you merge the two when you get into First Amendment issues, particularly within the Pentagon, when the public affairs people just push back really hard whenever IO seems to blend into that. Do you have any thoughts on that for any of the panel?
Yeah, I'd be glad to take that. I've known you for a long time, Lynn, and what the question you just asked was, again, a mix mash of terminology. I think the question more technically accurate would be, what about influence operations versus public affairs? Information ops, again, are application of tools. It all depends on what you want to use them for. If you want to ask about the question of using IO technology to influence a population, then within DOD, the communication to the U.S. citizenry, U.S. persons, is a public affairs issue. Communications to support a military operation overseas, that's in the region of MISO, Military Information Support Operations. It's an area that still remains as murky as it was when Lynn was on active duty with the policy side of OSD, because people keep coming up with what-if questions, and it usually involves some new communications media that we haven't done or had a discussion about the utility of before, and we end up revisiting these boundary lines again and again and again. Gentlemen?
So I'm flashing back since Linton asked the question. I think you were actually in the meeting, seemed to me, decades ago when the media actually called us on the carpet collectively in a joint staff environment to talk about their concerns about the concept and doctrine associated with psychological operations. And there was a meeting where we were supposed to, mostly the Army, assure the media that it wasn't doctrinally our mission to manipulate the media. And I would absolutely agree with what's been said. this is still a murky area, so we changed the name to protect the innocent, to pretend like we were headed off in another area doctrinally. But there is a latent and excellent fear out there on the part of the media that they're going to be manipulated. But I think that, and this goes a long way. You know, the Navy has a specialty community for information, the information warfare community. We're trying to move in the direction, hopefully, of making information sort of the fifth line business, if you will, in the Navy. And when we sat down and looked at all the kinds of disciplines that needed to be contained in that community, we looked at intelligence, we looked at cryptology, we looked at the communicators and the people who built battle management systems and the IT people. We looked at the space warfare people, and we looked at other people in the Navy who were involved in the information. And we actually incorporated the weather people because they were the largest users of, they're basically information collectors, and also are one of the single largest users of supercomputing today in order to do the diagnostics and analysis of the environmental inputs. We actually looked at public affairs, and we looked at foreign area officers in the context of who should be included in the community, and said, no, we're going to set these aside because it's too confusing and sends too many of the wrong signals. But we still struggle with this issue today, but the media is concerned that they're going to be manipulated.
I think the only thing I can say is I'm delighted to work for a lady who had 10 years experience as a member of Congress. We just went through the posture hearings last month. They ended last week with a hearing, one of the committees. She's adamant. She surrounds herself. We do practice hearings. I participate in a majority of those practice hearings with her so that she's well prepared, because when an issue pops up, whether it's related to what we're talking about today or some tragedy that happened out there, it's that sensitivity to how we handle the information or how someone else has manipulated the information that she wants to be ahead of the game on. So I can tell you she's extremely sensitive about, ensuring that the proper narrative gets shared.
I think a last comment I would add is there are two pieces of legislation that come to mind. That one of them is not targeted at DOD. That's the Smith-Mundt Act, which talks about the application of diplomatic resources or State Department resources not for influence of the U.S. population. And the other one is generally on an annual basis in the Appropriations Act, there will be a rider that puts in there and states explicitly that DOD MISO resources cannot be used for influence of the U.S. population or U.S. Legislative branch or U.S. leaders. It repeats year after year after year. So we have these things out there that provide legal prohibitions on doing that kind of thing.
European newspaper, and it's designed not to influence the American public. In this seamless web of Russian bots going against Facebook targeted advertising against the American people and vice versa, can you really still make that distinction?
I've been in a lot of those debates, and it's really difficult to make that distinction. I mean, DOD's interpretation of the law is no matter how obscure it may appear in the on the web page or wherever it is that we are on net, we have to have that identification that it's the Department of Defense talking. So you're at least offered the option of installing your own personal filter about how much you want to believe that story, because we identify the fact that we're doing it. The Russians, in their play against us, adhere to or are following some of the game book that says it's very difficult to manipulate a population that knows that you are trying to manipulate them. So they use almost exclusively clandestine means for getting their data out. Okay? So there's a difference in the way we behave versus them.
We got 4 questions queued up towards the back.
Hi, Greg Rowe, retiring cryptologist, been in the IO business for many years. It's kind of a naval-centric question, but hopefully it applies jointly. And Admiral, you mentioned Naval Information Forces and how that's gained traction within the Navy. It's got its own TICOM now, so on and so forth. For years, IO has struggled to be integrated and baked in the cake of military operations, and it's always been, hey, go sprinkle some of that IO fairy dust on our operation, make sure it works. And of course, it doesn't work, as Jake will say, because hey, you didn't consider specific capabilities. Can you guys comment on, has that shifted any? Have the next generation of commanders, as they come up, been smarter about, hey, these are real capabilities, and I have to start the planning process from the get-go? Is it more involved in the N3 and J3 process, the ops planning process? So it is really baked in as a capability set to achieve outcomes, rather than just an afterthought to be tried to apply at too late a date.
Actually, yes, it's gotten very deeply baked into things. You'll find IO cells associated with particularly with CENTCOM, where they're operationally engaged in a number of different areas, and you'll find that they are multidisciplinary. So you'll see folks who represent EW, MISO, some cyber in there, mostly as by the aspect of communication conduit and how you influence that. For a while there, UCOM had a vibrant cell when they were still responsible for the African theater of operations, and we were dealing with a lot of extremist groups on the continent. So that cell's now transitioned into AFRICOM, okay? So as the years have gone by, this has actually ended up being instantiated a lot into the operational forces. You'll see it routinely considered as part of planning considerations for any operation.
Yeah, I think your question is spot on. I mean, it's very timely because the environment we're in today, I call it the ultimate partnership domain. All right, the Air Force is doing some big moves. I mean, you'll hear about, there's talk about combining 24th and 25th Air Force down in San Antonio, the Security Hill comment that General Hayden talked about, because of the push towards, managing the information piece. We have another program which is a priority for our chief, which is called multi-domain command and control, because you have all aspects from ISR to technology to people to the issues, and how do we manage and integrate all these capabilities, kind of going along with the hybrid comment that I shared that some of our adversaries are applying. And so to me today is, having that awareness, not just internally, but along the lines of what we see in the National Defense Strategy with our allies and partners in industry and academia, and figuring out, as part of the mix, how do we together develop that extraordinary solution to move forward?
Next question in the back middle.
I'm a retired military signal corps officer, and had the honor of now serving as the director of cybersecurity, director of our security program at American Military University. I have a challenge to educate our young students, and the gentleman I heard you talk about in the Navy's focus on bringing in a new group of individuals to take the lead into this future of we're trying to shape for cybersecurity. Say that kind of loosely defining that term. My PhD is in cybersecurity, so I'm still struggling to define what that is. The challenge that I have today in academia is, how do we help? How do we shape our curriculum to answer that mail for that young airman, Marine, Army, Air Force, and go forward to meet this challenge? We talk about cyber warrior, we talk about the conversion of kinetic warfare and cybersecurity defense concepts, but what do I do for my curriculum today and into the future? And I'm sure academia in the room would also ask the same question, to help these young individuals to understand and get prepared for this future that they're supposed to meet the requirement to.
So I think it's a great question and deserves a fairly fulsome answer. I worry a lot about the fact that we have made cyber pretty much into what's the domain of a technology kind of problem. And what's missing today in the context of going forward and solving what is really the largest, probably most complex, fast-moving, interactive threat issue we have today, consistent with the nature and character of the information age, is how cyber and information conflict and also the intel community, again, all relate. We have been struggling with this problem for 20-odd years, trying to define cyber and how to essentially mark progress in the cyber area. And I have finally decided, trying to step away from this, and particularly looking at what's being offered at universities in terms of curricula, is that it tends to focus on computer science and the technology domains of this, when I believe the problem that the country has today isn't the technology of cyber, it's what I call the sociology of cyber. The sociology of cyber, to me, is what is the national strategy? What is the national policy? Let's nail down these doctrinal terms and be mindful of the doctrinal uses that other people use in the information area. What is the processes that we concern? How do we train our people? Training and education is critical here. How do we bridge the public-private divide? How do we fix our antiquated acquisition processes inside government to match the high-speed changing nature, essentially, of the cyber I/O problem? There are a huge number of areas I describe as sociological that where we need to have people who are policy experts in this area. If we can advance the policy so we can organize for success. I actually don't believe we're properly organized in the USG in particular to deal with this problem. We're full of stovepipes. Everybody looks up to optimize theirs, DOD, DHS, law enforcement, et cetera. The cross-cutting dynamics, to me, aren't sufficient around the doctrinal policy strategy areas. Leadership is afraid of this topic. Top-level leadership, it's so complex, is afraid of this topic. The nature and character of how we do governance around this, whether it's within industry or whether it's within the government, is really complicated. How do we do the alignment and convergence between the public and private, government and industry sides so we can get a better lie? How do we deal with the outside forces, the threats, and that sort of thing? You know, I spend a lot of time looking at things like definitions and trying to resolve the equities, the many equities that we have in here, civil liberties and privacy versus what government or others, including industry, particularly Silicon Valley industry, the Facebooks, et cetera, of the world are doing in this kind of area. And we're in the larger scene, you know, we're looking at the rest of the world, 80% of the rest of the world, looking at the definition of internet sovereignty as in the context of how they have control over their IT and telecommunications and information environment, control of it, and essentially how they have full transparency into what's happening with their populations. We're on another ethical plane from the people that do that. They're struggling with internal security issues and all the kinds of things that are unique to their state. But internal security is a really important issue. There are only 30 or so countries in the world that subscribe to the notion of a free and open internet and all that defines. And if we could define what we mean by free, I'm not talking about cost, free and open internet. So we have to go back to definitions and framework kinds of high-level things and the things we're willing to stand behind. You know, Linton brought up the issue of psychological operations. Sure, it's a very difficult thing to deal with, but we're on a high-level plane compared to the rest of the world when we deal with these kinds of issues, even though they're complex.
If I can piggyback off, the key word that resides with me is alignment. I come from 3 decades of for-profit environment, having sat on publicly traded boards, show me the beef. All right, the secretary today, Secretary Wilson, is all about asking her lab leadership, Air Force Research Lab as an example, tell me where I should be placing my risk. Tell me what I should be doing. What are the universities thinking about? I mean, she has a team of people for 12 months going to different universities to understand, where their focus is. To me, I find that to be also a little bit ludicrous. I mean, she needs to have her finger on the pulse to the capabilities and capacities that are out there. All right, and from my perspective, knowing what George Mason provides in relation to MIT or Carnegie Mellon or Virginia Tech or name that tune, having insight to those institutions of what they're focusing on and where their talent is step one. Not difficult to do. Okay. About a month ago, I was invited up to my alma mater because they'd formed a cyber curriculum. All right. I chastised them 4 or 5 years ago saying, you're doing your students a disfavor when you focus strictly on computer science as a general degree, okay? Because I sit here in this, private sector domain at the time, seeing where the opportunities are. So now they formed the curriculum. My caveat to them is, how are you going to be unique from all the other institutions that are out there? So part of the thought process is, since there's about 16 different critical infrastructures, oil and gas, healthcare, finance, monuments, whatever the others are, focus on some aspect of that so that you do look unique, so that the students, when they do come out of that academic environment, have something, again, depending on, hopefully the curriculum is intense and gives them the real, not just classical expertise, but hands-on expertise, but some sheepskin that makes them real attractive to not just the government, but also to the private sector.
So that question was asked by an individual who wants to know what to teach his students. Okay. All right. I would structure your curriculum to make them comfortable with 3 things. Okay. The first one is, we as humans live in systems that are all driven by stimulus and response. Your ability to make the system do something if you do something to it, okay? Most of the world's elite hackers are constantly thinking about how they can get the system to respond to something that they do. And they are constantly hunting for the ability to generate a stimulus and get a response, right? Second thing you teach them is, there is no such thing as security based upon standards or a checklist. That is the worst bullshit that anybody ever sold anyone on, okay? Today's stability is tomorrow's chaos, okay? And the last thing I would teach them is, teach them how to break things, okay? How to break them. People will bring solutions all day long for whatever your problem is. People sell us stuff all the time in DOD, and they don't pay anywhere near enough attention to what will break it, what will cause it not to function for its intended purpose. That's actually an art form. You have to teach people to think destructively. And out of that it was generally where, in my personal experience, we've had the most innovation has been out of someone who just looked at something they were given and went, geez, I wonder how in the hell you take that apart. How would I break that? You can't hire enough of those people for Amazon or for the code validators or whatever. We never get those kind of people out of the IT professional class, the mechanics that we teach to work our networks for us. Okay, so that's my suggestion.
Question far back left.
Hi, there are several new startups that focus on development of digital terrain cityscapes, including above ground and below ground models of what's there in a city or digital terrain. When coupled with, and ostensibly they're doing this development, the companies like Arcona, Phantasmo, Mapbox, they're all doing this ostensibly to some extent for like gaming purposes. When you think about this technology combined with something like augmented reality, you can start to think about possibilities, opportunities from an information operations perspective and things like that. And now that it can be, out for the masses, so to speak, you can entertain a much larger potential base of people that could exploit that type of technology. So from a DoD perspective, what do you see as far as some of the policy implications of this type of technology kind of running wild out there?
I'm not sure I feel competent to answer. I think that there's a lot of new thinking going on about what has happened when the definitions have expanded beyond cyber into the information warfare area. And we obviously need help across the whole spectrum of dealing with big data, social media, AI, all the other things that are coming down the path that can help us know really kind of what's going on and who's doing what to whom. And perhaps even focus on what's intended to be influence and manipulative and for what objectives. So in my view, if there are those kinds of technologies emerging and they have real applications, they'll be helpful.
Awareness of the technology is where I sit. All right, I don't pick winners and losers, but I want to know that that capability is out there so that when this alignment issue, when a requirement comes down, I can take the requirement from the seeker, person has a requirement, and align it with the solver. Okay, that integrated solution as you mentioned. And to me, knowing that I have that repository and it's kept updated, which does not exist. I mean, there are all kinds of repositories, but this simple type of thought process, where you start applying some of the, the buzzwords from big data to analytics to lakes, et cetera, need to be put in there. We have our priorities right now. You'll hear our Secretary for Acquisition talking about quantum and hypervelocity, et cetera. And then the companies start to come in and show off their wares. As far as how those companies fit into the solution, well, I think the companies need to have a more closer alignment to what our requirement is. Again, if I was asked, this is our requirement, I'll have a more focused answer. But from a broad base, the ability to be able to vector to where that solution resides, to me, immediately is very important.
That tech sounds pretty exciting to me from an environmentalist viewpoint. I'd love to have nothing better than an extremely high fidelity engineering level model of an urban area, because I personally would monkey with it all day long about how we could improve the energy grid, water distribution, sewage flow, all sorts of things in there. There's a lot that can be done to improve our urban environments. That's great stuff for that. I also happen to know that there's an awful lot of evil people in the world. And as soon as quite a few someones that I'm acquainted with had that, they would start active targeting. They would start playing out all sorts of what-if scenarios on how do you break a city, particularly cities where a lot of my friends and my family live, all right? So, that's kind of the duality that we reside in. Almost everything that people develop can be weaponized or turned to malicious purpose. And what I think we need to have the discussion about is not how to control proliferation of the tech, because we have valid non-military, non-defense uses for it. And we need to get that out there where people can innovate with it and make lives better. But we have to think from the beginning that people will misuse whatever comes out. And if it's known to us, we need people thinking about, okay, so what would you do about that? We can start ideating almost immediately about, how to protect ourselves or how perhaps to mitigate damage imposed by using that kind of a targeting mechanism.
One more question, middle right, and if you would, just introduce yourself and your organization, please.
Hi, yeah, I'm Robbie Robertson, CACI. General Hayden talked, actually, I appreciate the most recent comment about the weaponization of basically any technology. General Hayden talked about insufficient existing disincentives to people who target us. And I mean, that's not just the Russians, it's essentially everybody outside. So the question is, could you discuss how existing doctrine, policy, tools need to be updated to address this issue?
Well, first I would say that we need to have a candidate list of possible responses that we could actually think about implementing and deciding for policy implementation or technology implementation. I don't believe we actually have those list of candidate responses, and I think that then those candidate responses have to play into a, if you will, a leadership and governance environment where people can debate the policy issues at hand and the implications of it. So it's clear to leadership that we can choose from that list of options and responses in order to respond. And, you know, of course, we now have pretty much clear evidence of the boundaries of the Russian model of applying all of their means, including the recently mentioned Putin touting of all the new weapons. I would even also mention, just to make sure they add enough horsepower to their threat spectrum, the Russian application of the concept of escalate to de-escalate, which is a dare me kind of approach to deciding on any list of responses that might be considered. So again, I'm not in the government, so I don't know whether the government is coming up with a clear list of possible responses. That those responses would have to be worked not only out of the government, but socialized in a broader sense for their utility, their legality, their high plane nature and kind of ethics and that sort of thing. Keep in mind that we're talking about circumstances that are occurring mostly in this smoldering peacetime that we live in. You recall when I had read the definitions of information warfare, they were for support of ongoing military operations. So this is in a different category of things. It requires, in my view, bringing together some of the best minds in order to try to figure out what that list of responses might be.
And so I'm sure a majority of you understand what a tabletop exercise is or a war game. You know, running a specific cell. They give me a specific cell with the whole purpose of having a playbook. And prior to every war game in the past, what I would do is I would host and these war games were typically classified, but I would host a workshop a month or so in advance of the workshop so that I could build my playbook by inviting the private sector. Okay, I wouldn't expose the issues related to the classified game, but I'd set up a similar unclassified approach and then leverage the minds of the community that would show up. And I'm telling you, it was bees to honey. 500 or 600 people show up in Bossier City, which, by the way, is not easy to get to, for a couple of days, where I would take, if two people came from the same company, I would put a different dot on their what do you call them, their card. You'd get a green dot, you get yellow. And what we would do is we would probably do 2 or 3 war games, so to speak, during that time frame in which all the greens would go to one room, red another, yellow at another. They would spend an hour trying to figure out the results or their approach to that challenge, where each group was working the same challenge at the same time. What was fascinating is when the groups came back in and they picked their group leader to get up on stage and share their thought process in 10 minutes, that's where you saw the collaboration. One group may have had a similar thought process that collaborated with another group or overlapped, but it was those issues that were different that caused people to say, we need to chat, okay? That enabled me to build this playbook so that when I showed up at the war game, I had an idea now of who I could vector to that provided that non-traditional, extraordinary thought process, okay? Most of these games, again, are conducted in epic years, so trying to get the military leadership to think 10 or 15 years from now, most of them couldn't think 10 or 15 minutes from now. I digress. But the issue here is we need to have that advanced situational awareness, advanced awareness to what's out there, and know how to integrate those solutions so that when we do conduct these esoteric environments, that we have an idea of what capabilities and capacities exist in the public and private sectors.
I'd just like to make one final comment. I would like to distinguish between peace and war. I think it's important from a point of view of those of you who are associated with the national security communities. We have to be able to first deal with the full spectrum of activities under cyber, IO, et cetera, threat management, response, in the context of wartime operations and preparedness. And we're still on a journey trying to essentially get to a good lie in that particular area. Peacetime considerations with regard to strategic messaging, influence, and the kinds of things that the Russians are doing are kind of on top of that. Once conflict breaks out, that's sort of past and prologue in nature. But it is the order of the day that this kind of thing is ongoing. And if it's seen to be successful, it will be proliferated around the globe, little countries beating up on little countries, big countries beating up on little countries, et cetera, in the context of information shaping and messaging with some kind of desired effect that benefits them. This is the age we live in. This is the nature and character of conflict. This is what peacetime is going to look like for the future. So again, I think that we have to have a full set of responses that go up and down that full spectrum peace to war.
I want to stop talking about Russia and start talking about, for me, the nightmare scenario, which is China. All right? And this, in my personal fashion is I will eventually get back to the answer to your question. We have a situation emerging in the world where the leader of what will soon be the richest country has removed any requirement for a routine transition of power, okay? So his term limits are effectively off. He's reduced the size of the ruling committee in the country down to just 5, all right? They're ruthlessly eliminating any sort of internal dissension that they might have, and he's completely discarded the idea that free discourse of ideas is something that should be valued by the society. They have spent more treasure on the Great Firewall of China and on a very carefully tuned idea control and manipulation mechanism, and are creating themselves an enclave that would not allow deliberate intrusion of free ideas from the outside. So they're engineering that, and they're starting to bribe people bluntly in other countries to sign up with their One Belt, One Road initiative. That's really, what we're watching is the beginning of 1984. It's going to come, okay? And they're trying to do it as low-key as they possibly can so that on the day that anybody finally wakes up to it, it's too late to do anything about it. Now, getting back to what the Admiral was talking about, I don't believe that there's a distinction between war and peace when you're looking at that kind of a deliberate campaign to build a highly structured, highly thought-controlled future, all right? The fight has already started. Now, we have good questions inside the United States about what the role is of a military force and the Department of Defense in assisting our national leadership in defending itself against that kind of a vision. You know, and so we rightfully shall make a distinction about how you would use the military as part of that, but the entire government and our culture has to get involved in defending itself from that kind of a vision. Because if you want to have, and for your children and your grandchildren and our allies and our coalition partners, the ability to have a free discourse, to criticize one another, to develop any new idea that may come up to you and have an opportunity to push it forward, then that kind of a scenario actually has to be brought to an end. And that's a different kind of conflict than we've ever seen before. We haven't really started talking about how we face up to that. I agree that we don't need to go to war with China, but we certainly do not need to just sit here and accept that vision that they're beginning to construct. And they're basing it upon a very careful study of how information and data are used. How does it interact with cultural and social backgrounds? Okay? How do people ingest data? How do they understand it? How can you best present it to your own population? They have a government that's deliberately manipulating its population, whereas I've mentioned to you that's prohibited by at least 2 different types of legislation in the United States. I don't want to get involved in manipulating Americans. I'm not volunteering for that, you know. But what I'm saying is we have 2 different types of systems in direct competition with one another, and that's the kind of discourse we should be having. And then your question actually plays into that framework. What should we be doing in our government to defend ourselves against that kind of a future?
Question in the back, and then we'll come forward for the final question. Middle right. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Joe Danks, University of Maryland Center for Advanced Study of Language. And information operations strikes me as being a critical component is looking at the social behavioral sciences, the human sciences, linguistics, and so on. General Hayden made that point rather humorously when he talked about the hashtags coming out of Russia of take a knee versus take the knee. And if you're familiar with Slavic languages, you know where that comes from. And so we need to have that kind of knowledge available in social behavioral sciences of influence, et cetera, et cetera. And another point I just want to make is that I taught a course in the undergraduate honors program in cyber at the University of Maryland on cyber psychology, putting the human back into cyber operations and how that works. What is being done in the DoD to bring this kind of expertise into information operations? We've heard a lot of talk about the technology of it and learning about data and learning about tools, but what can be done to bring in the social behavioral sciences that strike me as being a fundamental foundation of information operations?
Okay, a couple of different things. The special operations community is actually where a lot of that direct social cultural interface with technology discussion goes on. And a lot of it has to do with the fact under that vast umbrella of special ops is where MISO lies. There have been huge sums of money spent since the 9/11 on looking at, can you predict social unrest via what you see in social network communications? Can you sense population mood? Can you do sophisticated ways of social network analysis? We all do man-machine interface work as part of standard engineering. Happens all the time for aeronautical systems, shipboard systems, things like that. You know, so there's sort of a rich history of people examining these kinds of issues. The one that I was mentioning to the C4ISR team last night that is relatively new is the issue of artificial intelligence and machine learning. okay? Different from one another, machine learning to abet the development of AI algorithms. A thing that DoD is right now deeply concerned about is academic sector and the private sector are not spending time on, when they're developing AI algorithms, they're not spending time on making them auditable. And I use that term carefully. They're not spending time on building a structured methodology by which the algorithm can be unpacked and we can do sensitivity analysis to understand in detail why any of them come to the conclusion that they do. We have a lot of products being brought in as black box solutions, and frankly, we can't apply them to most of our combat systems or decision aid systems, because if we don't understand in detail how they work, then we can't tell anyone using them what the probability is of their actual success and what that's based upon. We certainly can't ask a pilot to be fully reliant for his survival or her survival on a black box AI engine on the inside of the aircraft when we can't show exactly what is happening and why it comes to that conclusion. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that before we actually are willing to field things. And in the private sector, that same thing applies if you're talking about trying to apply that type of work to things like medical care, self-driving cars, or any other situation where you're going to put the welfare, health, or safety of a human being in the hands of some advanced analytical engine.
As I mentioned in my initial comments, the Air Force just stood up a brand new career field called 14F. This is the IO piece. It's made up of the behavioral sciences, so please Google that. I can't get into the specifics. I'm not current on it. But who better to think of, you get these young airmen that are able to kind of look back and become the acting adversary. In this program, in this career field, they're teaching airmen about understanding bias. I mean, this is a tough area, but someone made the smart decision within our service to go down this path. So kudos to the Air Force.
Okay, I guess I'm the last thing between you and lunch, but as I'm listening to this discussion about how the information operations that we see happening around us are as much a sociological problem as more a sociological problem than a technical problem in many ways, what I'm thinking about is that we should be thinking about treating our response as a public health operation rather than a military operation. And we've seen, I'm thinking about people saying, well, we're not allowed to try to influence the public. And I don't want to influence how you think about politics. And I don't want to manipulate your political opinions, but we do manipulate people in campaigns to wear seatbelts, wash your hands after you go to the bathroom, have safe sex. And we could look at public health campaigns for information safety and protecting yourself in a similar kind of public health context. And prohibitions that the DoD is subject to, the CDC might not be. And maybe we should have our intelligence community working with the CDC on a public health campaign.
I think that's an interesting analogy. My mind was flashing with an outbreak of information Ebola, or trying to vaccinate ourselves against this kind of thing. I think it's an interesting analogy, but I have to say in implementation it's really difficult to do. We do need some models, though, for thinking about it in a more, I think, pure, overarching, kind of sense. There could be some things in that area that would be useful.
Yeah, I really like that line of thinking because, there are some things that DoD could share with people. I mean, for centuries, militaries have used deception as means to further operations. There are bodies of people what we would call the TTP, the tactics, techniques, and procedures. And one of the interesting things that shows up in there and has a sort of rollover into civil society is one of the best ways to render a deception completely ineffective is to have copious amounts of factual information available, okay? The thing that drives me crazy is to hear terms like fake news or alternative facts, because what that does is it undercuts the foundation that our democracy can use to inoculate itself against this kind of stuff that Russians and to some extent the Chinese are using on us, okay? And so, you know, it would be interesting if you know that that's the kind of TTP military would use, then you could have a discussion with the CDC or other people about, so in the aspect of helping your democracy stay healthy, how would you prevent just simply huge amounts of lies, just being injected?
So just to make one final point, I spent some time in the deception perception management business, and certainly on the fringes of it for a long time. I will say that you have to recognize that when you do your targeting and your messaging, the things that are going to be the most successful from a point of view of the objectives and effects you're trying to create are things that are 75, 85, 90% truth-based. That means you're playing into an audience that's already predisposed to believe that. And given all the positions, for example, in our society that the Russians are playing into today, for example, or the Chinese could conceivably play into, both from a point of view of peacetime and wartime, military and civil influence-type information warfare operations. Those are the kinds of things you have to understand. They're targeting people that are predisposed. That's very difficult to inoculate against.
Okay, it's been a fascinating discussion. This has been a wonderful panel. John went, but thanks to you and John Russack for putting together such a great group, and thank you all, gentlemen, for wonderful insights. And we're very pleased to have had you here.
Thank you.